Hi everyone, thank you so much for attending today's webinar, Ocean Market Predictions for 2025. My name is Trine Nielsen and I'm the VP of Ocean here at Flexport. It's no surprise that 2024 was a bit volatile and there was a lot of surprises. In this webinar, we'll reflect on what we have seen happening during 2024, and then we will try and take out a crystal ball and see if we can predict some of the things that will happen in 2025. Disclaimer, it is a crystal ball, but we have brought some great experts to help us out. Before we begin, the usual housekeeping items. First of all, on your screen, you'll see a sidebar. It's at the right side of the main stage. If at any time you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us in the help chat located here. You can also ask questions via the Q&A on the sidebar. If time allows, we will host a Q&A at the end of this webinar, but because of our guests today, they're very passionate people, and because we have a very large attendance as well, we have also decided to arrange a live Q&A that will happen at the same time of the webinar. So if we don't get to answer your questions at the end, hopefully you will have a written answer either during the webinar, or we will make sure that you get an answer following the webinar. In the menu above your screen, you have two tabs. In the first tab, you can download a copy of today's slide deck, and in the second tab, there's a brief feedback survey for this webinar. We love your feedback, so please fill it in before exiting the webinar. And then a few legal things. Please keep in mind that all information provided in this session is based on the situation at the current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. All right, so with the practicalities out of the way, let's get started. So I'm really excited because we have a great agenda for today, and we'll kick off with some welcome and introductions, but we'll also be talking about the current market landscape, new alliances, what's changing. We'll look back at 2024, look at what did we learn, what worked well, what didn't. We'll also look at the more boring stuff, but important stuff, regulatory and tariff landscape. And then we have at the end of the webinar some supply chain recommendations for next year. So let's kick it off and get my three colleagues here on stage. Thank you everyone for coming. So guest first, I'm really excited. We have Bjørn and Lars here. So Bjørn, you're first on my screen. I was checking your LinkedIn profile, 40 years of experience in global supply chain and logistics. You have managed 220,000 TEU at your time at Electrolux. You also managed other products than just ocean freight. And you spent 16 years there driving their supply chain. You've also spent a year and a half at Cummins, where you managed more than 70,000 TEU. And now you're advising a lot of companies on how to deal with our lovely industry. So thank you so much for joining us. And then Lars, it's not the first time that you're joining us on a webinar. I've known your name for many years because at some point we were immersed together, but you left a little bit before me, and you're now the CEO and partner of Vespucci Maritime. You have a long background in the industry, and you were also part of starting the CNTL Maritime Analysis. And then, you know what, I was checking your LinkedIn profile as well. Do you know you have 140,000 followers on LinkedIn?
Yes, I actually did know that.
Good, because I also think during the whole Suez situation, you have been one of the most influential people in this industry, really talking about all the implications. So I'm really excited that you're here, both of you, to help us dig out what to expect for next year. And then my dear colleague Nerijus, you're a Flexport veteran, been here for 9 years. I've only made it a year and a half so far. So I'm really excited to have you here as well. You know this company and the industry in and out. You are head of procurement, so you speak to the dear carriers every day. So really excited to have you here. And let's get started. Okay, market landscape. So in this section, the plan is that we'll cover a little bit about the supply-demand situation, but also talk about how some of the peaks seem to be shifting at the moment and some of the operational challenges that we've seen. And then at the end, we'll cover alliances, what's happening in that space. So let's kick it off with the supply and demand. So first of all, if we just start by 2024, it's pretty clear to see that supply and demand, at least if looking at effective space and expected and demand, it's been pretty equal. If we look at planned space, there would have been more than enough, but of course we now have the diversions which changed the picture. But if we look into next year, and in terms of the demand growth expected to be 3%, and the added capacity to be about 8% of the fleet, we do expect that we'll have more or less equal supply and demand also going into next year, although it looks like it will be a little bit better. But Lars, I'm curious, because right now, when we look into 2025, we're doing all of our analysis based on Suez diversions continuing, and hence that a lot of capacity is caught up sailing around the Cape of Good Hope. What are your predictions looking into 2025? Will this environment continue? Do you see some carriers changing strategy, or do you see a situation where Suez will open?
The baseline I see right now is the Suez routing is not going to open. And what we have been used to in 24 will continue all throughout 2025. We have some regional niche carriers that do go through the Suez routing. We have CMA now with a couple of services go through, but nothing that materially changes the overall pattern. What I think is extremely important, though, to note is the tactical issue that will arise in February and March. This is when the new alliances phase in their entire new networks. That means all the networks will be in, let's call it what it is, complete disarray for a couple of months while you phase in the new ones. That has the practical implication that the carriers will have a very, very hard time managing, for example, a blank sailing strategy. So you could end up in a situation with a significant overcapacity issue potentially while the new services are being phased in. And if that happens, all observers of the market should be very careful not to assume that what we see in February and March has any bearing on what the rest of 25 will look like.
Okay. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about also some of the implications on some of these searches of demand and supply a bit later. So let's maybe go to the next slide, and Nerijus, maybe you can just briefly tell us what this is.
Yeah, just as you mentioned, there is quite a bit of capacity scheduled to arrive next year. Obviously, all these orders were placed during pandemic when the capacity wasn't enough. In a way, it's a blessing if that hasn't happened. This year, peak season was huge, right? Like we could barely get by. Capacity was very tight on some of the sailings. So again, in a way, it's a blessing, but I think it's a big call out for people just to know that the deliveries will continue through 2027 and actually 2028, and probably more of them will be scheduled. Obviously, we'll discuss this more. It's simply a data point, a baseline for our predictions that we're going to make later.
Perfect, thanks. And I think the supply side is actually one thing that is relatively easy for us to track, and we have examples like this. What is more interesting, and where we're also seeing some changes this year, and of course where it's difficult to predict, is the demand side. So those of you who attend our webinars once in a while, you know that we have a favorite question to ask all of you here, which is what are your current inventory levels, because that gives us an indication of the current demand picture. So if you wouldn't mind, it would be great if you could answer the survey. All right, and we're seeing it pop up here now. I'm happy to see we have the not applicable because I'm not a shipper. That's great. We've actually seen a relative trend that inventory levels have stabilized during this year, and it seems like that continues. We have also seen a few companies who who have said that they have stocked a bit more than usual simply because of the situation and the operational issues. So I guess the survey here represents pretty well that scenario. Okay, thank you everyone.
I think Trine, if I may,
Please.
there has been a lot of front loading going on to no one's surprise. But the question, I appreciate this is a poll, right? But there's no single answer to that, because there are probably a lot of companies out there who have restocked a long time before they normally would. And that introduces massive uncertainty in the accuracy of what you're restocking with, right? So probably if I had to sit and take that poll in any company I've worked for or with, I'd say I have way too much of stuff I don't need, and I have maybe too little of what I'm probably going to end up with, because there are only two kinds of sales forecasts: lucky and wrong, and that effect is amplified because people have front loaded. So I think we should be careful concluding that just because warehouses are full, which they really are, especially in the US, that means that they know that people are going to stop shipping.
Yeah, that's a very good input. Thank you. And I think if we go to the next slide, that's one of the interesting things that we're seeing in the market dynamics at the moment, right?
Yeah.
We have seen some shifts in seasonal peaks. Peak season seems to have come early and unexpected, and there's a lot of unexplained demand, both in the European and in the American side. And then on top of that, and probably driven by that also because of the operational challenges. So we've seen, so the graph here on the right, that is our own ocean timeliness indicator. And as you'll see, so by the way, don't look at the specific days here. This is a weighted average across a lot of corridors, but it indicates that the time boxes spent on the water continues to increase and has been increasing throughout this year. So this is also an indication that lead times are just prolonging, at least on the port-to-port leg. And we've seen, of course, on-time performance globally, 55%, pretty poor. We've seen a lot of blank sailings and port congestions. But I'm curious, Bjørn and Lars, I mean, what are you seeing from your different angles in terms of some of the market adjustments that have happened this year that are not the same as last year?
You can see some of the adjustments is pretty straightforward. Now that it takes 2 weeks longer to go around Africa, that in itself would mean any kind of seasonality, like the peak season, by definition happens 2 weeks earlier than you would have imagined. On top of that, you have also had issues where obviously a lot of importers, for good reason, were concerned if things arrive on time. So on top of those 2 weeks, they add additional buffers. And that all conspired for us to have a peak season happening already in early May. And looking forward, I would expect to see the exact same for the usual seasonality leading up to Chinese New Year, which is basically going to start right around now.
For some trades, the ILA uncertainty would have been a big factor in the front-loading decision as well. And I think it's pertinent to call out that the ILA situation is still there. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's been kicked to the corner. And anybody who's listening here who thinks that this is now a bullet you've dodged, you should really think again.
Yeah, maybe just adding to that again, the practicalities. Anybody shipping from Asia to US East Coast, if you want cargo to clear the ports before a strike on Jan 15th, you need to ship cargo in the next 2 weeks.
No.
And if you go beyond the next 2 weeks, you got to reroute through the US West Coast if you want to dodge that bullet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is a good point, because obviously the contract is not yet signed.
No.
There's just been an extension of the existing, and there's still some topics that are outstanding.
Yeah.
Okay. But then I think let's move to one of the market shifts that has already been touched upon. And Nerijus, you know the carriers so well, so I'll let you go through this one.
Yeah, quite a few changes are happening, and they have been happening forever. We'll show on the next slide, but don't do that yet. So I do think it's important to discuss this. The only thing that's stable next year is probably Ocean Alliance, right? Nothing is changing within that alliance. All carriers remain intact. They are basically keeping services almost as is. That is a very large alliance. The members combined of that alliance have 8.4 million TEUs of capacity. I think it's important for people to know that not everything is shared within the alliance. Specifically within the Ocean Alliance, roughly half the capacity is shared. Everything else is either independent or shared via VSAs or vessel sharing agreements with different carriers, often even within the alliance. Outside of the alliance. So roughly 4 million TEUs big, 40 services, stable. That's probably the biggest selling point for them next year. Then you have a Gemini cooperation, not an alliance, between Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, who is leaving the alliance. So these members have 6.6 million TEUs. Again, that's the membership, not the membership. That's the actual capacity they have combined. But the alliance or cooperation itself will only share 3.7. Maersk will put 40% of their capacity in the cooperation, and Hapag-Lloyd will put 60. It's a unique alliance. Again, I keep saying it, a cooperation, because it will operate differently. It's not going to be a loop calling 5-7 ports in Asia, going to Europe or United States. It will be more of a shuttle services with a hub and spoke model. It's intended to increase reliability. 80 to 90% is what they claim that they will get. The end goal is 90%. For now, it's a claim. We all hope it will work because, as you have seen, the reliability is something that badly needs to be fixed. So looks promising, but yet to be proven because we're not yet in 2025. Then you have the alliance. Again, Hapag-Lloyd left them. It's ONE, Yangming, and HMM. The members have 3.6 million TEU individually. They share quite a bit. I would estimate about 70%. It's difficult to say an exact number because not all services have been announced. For example, Transatlantic for Premier Alliance or Med to US is yet to be announced. We expect that to come sometime in November, probably next week. The interesting thing with Premier Alliance is they actually have a large VSA agreement with MSC on Asia-Europe. They needed it. Again, it's somewhat of a smaller alliance by itself, but with the VSA, I think they are accessing a lot more important services to become essentially a global carrier and be able to offer reliable coverage for customers. Last thing on Premier, which I find it fascinating, they know they need to get bigger. If you look at ONE has 600,000 TEUs on order of new ships. Compare that to Maersk, second largest carrier globally, is 500,000. So again, they will grow. Last thing I will say is MSC. MSC left 2M and they will act independently or somewhat independently. Like I mentioned, they have VSAs with ONE separately from Premier Alliance. They have large VSAs with ZIM on the Transpacific services, primarily East Coast, some PNW. They are by far the largest carrier globally by themselves, 6.2 million TEUs. It's hundreds plus of services. It's not a direct comparison because they are independent. So this is the new reality we're going to face in 2025. And I think it's important to share where we came from. Don't want to spend too much time on that, but I do want to look back in the history. So next slide. It's quite busy. I find it quite fascinating. If you look where we came from, again, alliances is nothing new. Started in 1996 with Global Alliance, Grand Alliance. Some carriers were acting independently. At the very beginning, many of you remember it was a mess. Carriers used to be having different size of vessels on the same loop. They used to call different terminals. Like one carrier would go to this part of Long Beach, another carrier would go to Los Angeles. The truckers were confused. The chassis were all messed up. It was a mess. It did get a little bit better, and somewhere in 2016, it felt like things are quite normal. You have a big stable alliance, the Alliance, Ocean Alliance, 2M, and ZIM independently, but sharing quite a bit of space with Maersk and MSC at that time. And then we hit COVID. All of a sudden, everything became a mess. And something needed to change. I don't think it was just COVID, but again, it was quite a few years of simple stability. If you see, change was happening quite a lot from 1996. And then from 2018 to 2025, not much has changed. For the first time since 1996, instead of more consolidation, we're actually seeing some carriers, MSC specifically, leaving an alliance, and Gemini Corporation have been hauled. So is this the beginning of a new trend? Lars, maybe you can share some thoughts yourself.
Yeah, just a few thoughts. I mean, first of all, personally, I probably wouldn't use the word consolidation when we talk alliances, because it's an operational collaboration. It's not consolidation like when you have M&A. But that aside, what I find much more interesting this time around is the diversity in the ways networks are being designed. I think this is the first time in decades where we see this level of diversity in different services. Obviously, one extreme would be Gemini, with their, let's call it, super hub and spoke and shuttle setup. And the other extreme would be MSC, that really has gone all out in having services with a lot of port calls, but therefore also a lot of direct services. Then we've got Premier and Ocean Alliance in a spectrum in between. But it's going to leave shippers for 2025 in a situation where it's going to be much more complicated to figure out which ones of these services are necessarily the right for your business, because they are going to be vastly different. And that's something we have not seen in a long, long time. Personally, I find that interesting in terms of the competitive dynamics in the industry, because it's going to be about more than just price.
It is, and it's interesting to see if BCOs will know how to navigate that, right? Because generally speaking, a BCO sending out a tender will ask for a transit time that's tied to a given rate that a carrier offers, and that's pretty much it, right? There are, of course, some very large BCOs who really dive into the details and I only want my cargo on PS3 or whatever, but not many shippers do, and especially not many small shippers do. So those who are on this call really need to either pay attention if you're running your own tender to this. You're being spoiled for choice in many ways, but that can be a danger. Or you need to get very close with your freight forwarder, for example, Flexport, but any freight forwarder, any agent you use to help you navigate this, and not just rely on, well, this is the transit time, because the rotation that leads to that transit time may or may not be risky, or some will be riskier than others.
Let me just add maybe one comment on that, because there's at least I come across the misperception often that a direct service by definition is faster than a transshipment service.
No.
When you look at the Gemini and the MSC networks, that is most patently not true. In some cases, absolutely the direct is the fastest. In some cases, it's actually the transshipment service that can be considerably faster than the direct service.
Yeah.
I just say recently we had a case where one of the ships was 45 days late on a direct sailing simply because of congestion in Cristobal on the way and other things. So like direct doesn't mean fast, more reliable.
Nor does transshipment necessarily. I mean, people talk about, especially since this announcement of the Gemini Alliance, people have started talking about transshipment as the root of all evil, right? And it's like, oh, I don't know about this Gemini because it relies on transshipment. Like, transshipment is not happening today, right? Most BCOs are already transshipping all over the place. I was at the Shinetta conference in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago, where Rolf Jensen said it's something like 15 or 18% of all shipments that currently move with APAC or with Maersk or with most other carriers are transshipped. And with some carriers it's more often than that. And in fact, the number of transshipments, according to Rolf, was not really going to increase materially. We're not talking about a tripling, maybe plus 4 or 5% on top of what's already happening today. So be careful that you don't walk away from transshipment, because that's by definition a bad thing.
I'll just say that one size doesn't fit all anymore at all. Exactly. No. Transshipment can also be a bad thing, can be a good thing. It depends where. And every single service is unique, and you have to, like Bjorn said, be very, very careful when you select. And you need to be able to pivot. For example, Busan could be a great transshipment point. If it gets congested, it could be a mess for 2 months, and you should be able to pivot. But let's maybe keep moving, because we are probably a bit behind.
I think great analysis, and ports are becoming much more important. I think that's also my conclusions. Like knowing which port you're going through might actually be what saves you a week on your lead time. And it changes.
Yeah.
Okay, but I think we'll cover a little bit more about this when we look back a little bit. But I think if I was a customer of the industry, probably what I would have felt going out of 2024 was that access to space was challenging and or expensive. And by the way, I am kind of a customer because I'm still a customer of the carriers. So don't get me wrong. But at least one of the biggest challenges that we have seen, and of course also with the supply and demand situation changing so drastically, has really been the volatility in the rate levels, but also in the space situation. And this graph is just showing across trade lanes. It also shows there's a few trade lanes that were not as much impacted. So if you're moving from Europe to the US, it's really not been as volatile. If you move out of Europe to Asia, it's not been as volatile. There's very open space there. But on the key trades, Asia into Europe and US, the rate volatility has been pretty extreme. And it actually looks like on this graph that on Asia into North America, that rates are at or basically that rate levels have been at COVID rate levels. And Bjørn, I see you shaking your head because I would like someone here to explain why it looks like that, because that we don't think that's the case.
I don't think it's the case. I move in BCO circles, very wide BCO circles. I've never heard yet, and I took an active interest in it, as you can imagine. I've never heard of anyone who paid COVID type rate levels. I can only assume that some of these indexes that are underpinning this chart have added, I don't know what they've added in there, that is not reflective of what the vast majority of people are paying. Can I rule out that rate wasn't out there? No, but I've not heard of it. I haven't seen it in the wild. Most people were at maybe 8 to 10,000, with 8 closer to 8 than to 10, and not to the 17s and the 20s and the 30s that people were paying during the pandemic. So I'm not sure what's going on here, but I don't think it's reality.
Lars, do you want to put a comment?
Yeah, I just want to add to that one of the challenges, and that goes across all the different indices, is precisely what is included, what is not included. If we just pick on one simple example, think back to early COVID times, when all focus was typically on the SCFI became high, the carriers got criticized by the Chinese government in terms of these high rates. What did the carriers do? They introduced equipment availability surcharges in China, which is a local surcharge and is not captured under the SCFI, for example. And that's a material part, obviously, of what a shipper eventually was going to pay, but was not included in the index. All different indices right now have various methodological pros and cons, but it is difficult to compare and say it's an apples to apples, because you do have all these quirks in the indices.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's keep this in mind, because we'll talk a lot more about indices a bit later. But first, let's go to the next slide, because what we have tried to do here is we typically try to do a retrospective about, if we, today, if we knew everything we knew today, what type of contract should you then have signed? And I think if we just look at the numbers on this graph, which represents fixed rates, which is the green and the red line, and then floating rate levels, which is the blue and the light blue greenish line, it looks like fixed rates was the absolute best deal in 2024. But how much did actually move on these fixed rates? I think this is the big question. Bjørn, what is your view? You deal with a lot of BCOs.
I think something happened with your sound.
Yeah.
Hang on.
Oh, there we are.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I was directly a BCO for the period that this chart covers, and it was really a mixed bag. As a BCO who contracts both with freight forwarders and with carriers directly. The vast majority of our carrier direct contracts were honored. That's not to say that freight forwarders, just to preempt any, I'm not casting aspersions. You contract with carriers on a different kind of contract, right? On different contract durations and a mix of them. So I'm not accusing carriers of raising rates when carriers did, forwarders of raising rates when carriers did not. It's just that towards BCOs, a lot of carriers, and certainly the ones I chose to work with, did not. So I'm not surprised that some cargo has moved contracted rates. I will also say carriers honored my contracts until I came with one TEU more than I had forecasted. That TEU did not move at contracted rates, right? So there is that little caveat. But it has been my impression also from talking to other BCOs. Not every carrier honored contracts. And among BCOs, it wasn't the same carrier that broke contracts with all of them. Some people had their contracts dishonored by Maersk, some had them dishonored by MSC, some Maersk never changed the rates. But by and large, I think carriers stuck by their direct BCO contracts more so than they stuck by their forwarder contracts. Up to allocation and not one TEU more.
And let me just add a comment in terms of what I also saw this year was two different things. I saw carriers much more closely looking at their BCO contracts and say, did this BCO abide by our contract in 23 when the rates went down? In that case, the carrier would be happy to honor it in 24. If the BCO renegotiated you in 23, guess what? They're not going to load on the fixed rate contract in 24. But I also see carriers learned from the pandemic experience. Let's take one example, Maersk. During the pandemic, Maersk was the carrier that at least stuck the most by their contracts. And they discovered, again, this is the aggregate, it's not individual shippers, but in the aggregate, the loyalty they gave their customers on the way up was not repaid when the market went down. So Maersk has gone down the path of basically being as loyal to the shippers as shippers were to them during the downturn.
Yeah, and I think this actually represents well, right? It represents depending on who you are, which company you are, which carrier you contract with, the history of that contract, and how you have delivered or performed. Yeah. You might have gotten space at the rates, you might have gotten a PSS on top, you might have gotten your allocation cut in half, you might have gotten your allocation cut entirely. And I think across the board in 2024, there's just one thing that is pretty clear, is that a fixed contract is no longer necessarily meaning a fixed contract. The carriers and the freight forwarders, the like, are very quick at adjusting to market circumstances. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Nerijus.
Won't spend much time on it, but I think it's quite unprecedented. This is Transpacific rate differential between East Coast and West Coast, and we'll give you some advices and analysis a little bit later, and you'll see why. But basically, it used to be $1,000, maybe $1,200, depending on a week or a month, was your rate differential between Transpacific importing, again, East Coast versus West Coast. In pandemic, that potentially was more. But as you can see, it's been extremely volatile at times, rarely, but still at times, routing via East Coast was almost as cheap. In fact, today it's actually pretty close as West Coast. Now, how long it will last, nobody knows. There's just the one call out is you can no longer rely on that 1,000 differential being a market. It will continue moving and evolving. If there is a strike on the East Coast January 15th, which is still a big possibility, you will probably see prices skyrocketing on the East Coast. Afterwards, you will see cargo shifting back, and then probably the rates on the East Coast may end up being cheaper than the West Coast. Again, a simple call out, a simple pricing strategy or a fixed rate, specifically on TPEB, doesn't really work. Again,
No.
spending a few seconds, because some importers are from, let's say, Indian subcontinent, completely different. East Coast is cheaper. Transatlantic, also East Coast is cheaper. This is specifically calling out the TPEB, but the same logic, the differential is different, but the same logic applies to all trades. Bjorn, I see you want to add something.
I'm trying to figure. I'm wondering whether there's also some Panama in here.
It is.
A lot of people had different requirements because of the closure of the Panama Canal. I think that plays a role in this swing. I don't know.
Exactly.
Lars will know better than me, but I just have a gut feeling that Panama is in that chart somewhere.
I will say, so what this is it's definitely Panama. It's also pandemic, right? Carriers were speeding the vessels up. They wanted to ship to the West Coast instead of East Coast, so they put more space.
Yeah.
East Coast prices were surging. Then you have low water in Panama, Red Sea crisis, prices always went up, then the congestion on the West Coast, then congestion on the East Coast, then the ILS strike, then pre-strike. So there's a lot of happening, but I just simply think that it will continue happening, and you simply can no longer rely on this being stable, which makes planning very difficult. And you know what the right price is. When you see differential being at 4,000, you know, like, am I overpaying? You need to go to market. It simply isn't a good solution to have that, which is, I think, ties into the next topic that Trine wants to go later.
Yeah.
Oh, that's actually a little bit later. So let's first discuss this.
Yeah. No, I think this one is just, and I think we've talked about it a little bit, but in 2025, so what we've seen in 2024 is that blank sailings have still been a thing. But Lars, we were talking about blank sailings. There's a difference in blank sailings, and my feeling is that 2024 has been a little bit less deliberate from the carrier side. But maybe just for everyone here, can you just give us the education of the blank sailing concept and why it's so important today?
Yeah, because basically there are blanks and there are blanks. In some cases, there are physically not enough ships. That was the case during peak season 24. It was the case during the pandemic. And if you physically don't have the ship, what are you going to do? I mean, you have to blank a sailing. Then there are blank sailings when it's by choice. I mean, we see that every year after Chinese New Year. We see it after Golden Week, where we know demand is going to drop off a cliff. So obviously, there's going to be some blank sailings. So we have to distinguish between, is this driven by a physical lack of capacity in the market, or is it carrier choice? And most of 24, what we have seen here is it was driven by a lack of vessels. The point where we have now seen, I would say, conscious, deliberate blank sailings is the seasonal one we usually see around, in this case, Golden Week, for example.
Yeah. And I think the interesting part is, even if Suez did open and we then see a lot of chaos in the short term, blank sailings would not go away, because then we would have too much capacity in the market. So carriers would still continue to blank capacity to keep the rates high. And I would say, like, carriers have become really good at actually executing these blank sailings and managing rate levels better without colluding. So it's one of the
maybe a detail here, because I think a lot of shippers have seen that when they hear carriers use blank sailings and then hear the word rates, that's where they think collusion. What we have seen for years is, I have not seen any, again, if we think only the blank sailings by choice, so the ones where carriers choose to blank sailings, I have not seen any analysis where blank sailings leads to increases in freight rates. What we have seen at times is blank sailings are used to prevent a catastrophic drop in freight rates when the demand is not there. But there is nothing to suggest that deliberate blank sailings have ever led to an increase in freight rates.
That's a good point. That is correct. We haven't seen that either.
And that's no different. I know hopefully there are a lot of manufacturers and shippers sitting out there, right? If you just compare with your own world, you're running a factory, you're not going to keep running that factory if there is no demand for what the factory outputs, because you know that people are going to pay less for your product. There's no difference between the shipping industry and your own factory. I'm just as tired as I think the four of us are of hearing this collusion cry every time the rates go up a little bit or a ship doesn't sail. It's carriers managing their manufacturing line, as it were, just as well as any manufacturer would or should.
And I did
So,
actually say without colluding.
yeah, I know that. I know
Yes.
that. I know that. I wasn't aiming it at you at all. You said the right thing. There is no collusion.
But it's a good point, because of course carriers' business model is also based on utilization, and if the
Of course it
utilization
is.
is too low, they lose money, and none of us should be interested in carriers losing money.
No.
That's at the end of the day the outcome. Okay, but let's look at some of the other things which this also has a little bit of an impact on. Schedule reliability. I mean, it's improved a little bit also because transit times have been updated. But I look a lot at one of the things we want to do is to give customers predictive transit times. This year, it's been extremely difficult getting it right because of not only the longer transit times on port to port, but also the congestion that continues to come up. Then there's poor weather. There's always something unexpected happening, making the ships delayed. I mean, I am really hoping that Gemini reaches the 90%. I think it would be good for everyone to have a very reliable setup. But looking at the current levels, it seems very difficult. But I'm rooting. Lars, one question for you, because I saw something. It looks like that Asia into US West Coast is one of the lowest reliability that we actually have here. And that surprised me a little bit, because I would assume that lowest reliability would be trades impacted by the Suez diversions. Do you know why this is?
I don't know factually, but what I would at least, you can say, make an educated guess or hypothesis around is it has something to do with the length of the transit time as well. Because if my vessels from Asia to Europe arrive in Europe late, I have a very, very long time to catch up to that and get back on schedule when I'm back out in Asia. Whereas if I arrive late or get delayed over in, say, Los Angeles or Long Beach, it's a very short hop back to Asia. So unless I really go full steam, I might not be able to make up that. So basically, if you are delayed on a head haul trade on Asia-Europe, you can make it up on the back haul. If I'm delayed on a TP trade to US West Coast, I might not be able to make it up on the back haul, and therefore it perpetuates through more cycles before I can catch up.
Okay. So conclusion is that regardless the trade, there's challenges across. And it's, of course, one of the things to look out for also next year in terms of supply chain planning when you look at your lead times.
And I just add one more thing on this really quick. It also depends on service. Some services are running at 0% reliability. Others are running close to 100 premium services. So these are averages. So just wanted to pull that out. Pay attention to every single service. There is no one solution. But yeah, let's keep moving.
And then last one of the things we've seen on our side, and Bjørn, I also wanted your input here, but it's really that index-linked agreements and enforceable contracts are increasing in popularity because they give consistency in terms of access to space. And while an index-linked agreement is not necessarily predictable, what will the cost be 1 month from now, it is predictable in terms of the fact that it will follow the market. And often you'll also, of course, have some sort of a discount linked to these agreements. Bjørn, what are you seeing here?
I suspect there are more than a few people on this webinar who know that index-linked contracts are my particular hobby horse. I advocate them. I've advocated them for many years. I've used them since 2012, and they can be simple or they can be hard. They're not as easy to negotiate as people think, but once they're negotiated, they kind of run themselves. I was encouraged that the 2 conferences in Europe I participated in the last month, where I was invited to speak on the subject of index contracts, and a lot of people, shippers, BCOs, and NVOs, came up and either told me that they've actually started using them or that they are really serious about using them. The NVOs particularly serious about using them because now, for the first time ever, they're actually getting tender requests where the shippers are asking for an index option. So I think we're maybe, it's not going to be a tsunami, but it's certainly a wave that's building. It's much bigger than it's ever been. predictability is one thing that comes out of index predictability. It's not that predictable, right? I mean, any more than the market is, because it follows the market. And the market is potentially not terribly predictable, given how many people missed their budgets big time, right? Myself included. What they are is they are time savers, they are simplifiers, and they are also relationship builders. Because once you enter into one of these deals with a carrier or with a forwarder, and they are typically long-term deals, they should be long-term deals, as in longer than a year. My recommendation is 3. And the hassle and the animosity and the adversity of adjusting rates every 2 weeks goes away. You're going to build a completely different relationship between customer and service provider. So I think we're going to see more. The days are gone when a single fixed rate would be the perfect hedge across a year, right? It's not going to happen. So I think at least some of your volume should go on index contracts. Not all of it. They're not a panacea. And there are trades where they're completely impossible to create. Intra-Asia, for example. I don't know how you find an intra-Asia index, right? Or other intra-trades. And there are trades for which no reliable index really exists. But for part of your volume, if it's predictable and on good trade, to park it on an index contract, in my mind, is the only sensible thing to do when faced with this kind of volatility and the knowledge that you're not going to be allowed to ride on your fixed rates no matter how clever you were in your negotiations. If those two things are true, then you really need to have index contracts as part of the answer, in my mind.
And Bjørn, just with a quick answer, because one of the things many people ask about is how to convince your CFO, because you cannot build a budget on an index. So very quickly, how do you convince your CFO?
Show him how well you performed against the last 3 years' budgets that you created that weren't created on the index, because you didn't, did you? Your CEO is asking you, setting an impossible task, right? The fact of the matter is that the vast majority of shippers, and I count NVOs among shippers, we've all been living in an index contract since roughly May of 2020. No. In the sense that we've been subject to the vagaries of the market. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. But the choice has never been given to us, right? Yeah. I think that's where also, as Lars said, the rules of the game has changed a lot. There's no negotiation anymore. The market has changed. Here are your new rates if you're a carrier speaking to a shipper, or the market has changed. Here are the new rates you will give us, or we will move our cargo if you are a shipper speaking to a carrier. Right? There's no negotiation and no give and take anymore. So why are you wasting thousands of man hours, and I know this to be true, on something that's going to happen, on administering something that could have taken care of itself?
Okay, good. So let's ask the audience, what type of contracting are you planning on doing for next year, for 2025? All right. As the answers come in, same amount, more on fixed, nothing on fixed. Okay, but this I guess represents also many companies. Well, it really depends on what company you have and how you're structuring your business. If you have 2 containers a year, an index agreement is definitely not worthwhile. Okay, so let's move on. We're hoping we can make it for at least just a quick Q&A. So we'll pivot. We'll talk about the boring stuff, the regulatory and tariff landscape. So let's go to the first slide. Listen, there's a lot of regulatory changes in the EU, especially related to sustainability. Lars, you put it really well when we were talking here. really what this means is added cost. The ETS surcharge got implemented this year. It's going to be coming at a higher cost next year. And then, of course, in the US, I think the situation is quite interesting, because here there's a lot of tariff discussions, and there's also the de minimis discussion happening in terms of which could be changing quite a few trade patterns existingly. But Nerijus, you have a few slides that show us why we should actually care about some of these things. So I'll let you go through that.
Yeah, because of changing regulations, changing tariffs and stuff like that, like the trade is completely changing. So I thought it would be good to call out. We haven't done this in a while. And if you look at the US imports data since 2016, few things you see. One, US imports are growing quite a bit. They've grown about 7 million TEUs since 2016, 21 million to 28 million predicted this year. China is losing share. They are growing number of TEUs. I think they grew from 10 million TEUs to 11 million TEUs. So it doesn't mean that China is losing TEUs, but they are losing share. But US importers are definitely changing sourcing. Vietnam has grown tremendously from roughly 4% to almost 10% today. And you can see the trend is very steep up. So it's likely will continue. European market is slightly down, and then India is another market that's growing quite fast. Same thing with South Korea, Thailand, Cambodia, small numbers but huge, 4x growth in. So one thing is clear: shifting is happening towards Southeast Asia, South Korea, and India, and companies are reducing single sourcing, and they are diversifying. Now, why that is important is, one, you should consider doing the same if you are expanding, and two, you should, next slide, have in mind that changing sourcing may completely change how you import today. For example, if you import from China, more than likely you're importing via the West Coast. Again, it's simply by looking at the data. Of course, if your warehouse is in New York, but again, looking at the data, it's mostly West Coast or rail via the West Coast. India has always been East Coast, and recently more direct services were launched to US East Coast. So even more importers have shifted. If they import from India, East Coast, it has to be East Coast. If you do West Coast, you do things wrong, you overpay, reliability is low, because you are using Transpacific networks, with one exception, with one carrier. Southeast Asia, same thing. Used to be West Coast, but completely changed towards East Coast. In fact, East Coast became larger for Southeast Asia than the West Coast. You see a bit of a trend recently. East Coast lost share for the total market, and Southeast Asia is primarily driven for things we have discussed before, changing ILA, congestion, and stuff like that. But I think trend is pretty clear. In my opinion, that trend will continue. After the strike has been resolved, East Coast will continue gaining share of US imports.
Okay, so this brings us to recommendations. So first of all, let's just talk about 2025. We promised to pull out a crystal ball, and as you can hear here, a lot of things is sort of being focused on. We think Suez will remain closed, and a lot of assumptions is based on that. But the one thing that is also true is that there's a lot of unknowns that will impact. And I think the conclusion of this is that there will be a very volatile environment going into 2025 as well. There's the US East Coast ILA contract renegotiations. We continue to see conflict in the Middle East and in Ukraine. There's the continued tensions between China and US, tariff discussions. And then, of course, there's the new alliances, which we expect will have a lot of operational implications, especially in the beginning of the year. And this is what we know of. The unknown is often the one thing that puzzles us the most or gives us the biggest headaches. But Lars, anything you see or anything you would have added to the list?
The only thing I would add to that is, I think everyone listening to this out there need to make sure they mentally readjust. What we are seeing geopolitically is not crisis. Well, we see conflict, but it's not a crisis. What we see is a new normal. This is the consequence of a world that is already multipolar. So we're going to see more conflict going forward. This is not an aberration.
Yeah.
No, I agree. There are other things you can throw on top of that. We haven't talked about the climate change that's obviously causing massively amplified natural disasters around the world. When Asheville in the mountains can drown in rain, and the water levels in Valencia can rise 3 meters in 2 hours, these things you haven't even thrown on top. I agree with Lars. I gave a talk recently where I encouraged people to stop talking about black swans, because a lot of the stuff is not black swan events. We love to call them that because then our CEO goes, "Oh yeah, okay, well then it's not your fault." But they're not black swan events. A lot of them are entirely predictable. I mean, tariff war between the U.S. and China, war in the Middle East. I mean, who saw that coming? I mean, come on, they're not black swan events by the strict definition of black swan events. Black swan events today is a vessel arriving on time or a contract being adhered to. That would be truly black swan, right? So I entirely agree with Lars. I just think that's half of what you need to worry about next year and for many years to come. So you see what's happening in the BRICS countries, building more and more onto their cooperation. That's going to set off some shockwaves as well. So yeah. It's going to be a good, fun ride.
I was just about to say, you're making us all a little bit depressed, Bjørn, but...
no, it's fun. This is why we're in logistics.
Note...
I mean, crisis is a terrible thing to waste. It gives you all kinds of opportunities to improve your processes and think about why you're doing certain things.
Yeah, and of course also like diversify from competition, differentiate. Yes. I think supply chain is becoming something that you can really differentiate on, because if you navigate better than competition, you have a competitive advantage. And I think this is also, so the recommendations we're putting in for today are high level, but also very much like, so diversify your rate strategy. Make sure, don't only rely on having fully fixed deals. Make sure you also plan in for some floating index-based and factor in the seasonality you have in your business. Clear recommendations also diversify your carrier and alliance strategy. You should both do it to mitigate the challenges of the operational situation, so blanks, so that you have a quality and consistency. But you should also do it to avoid port congestion on certain strings, and to make sure that you can potentially leverage some of the alliance differentiation that is coming over the next year. Transit time and price differentiated services, you can use them to optimize growth. So maybe having your goods earlier than competition might actually be an advantage, not the cost of those goods. So premium products and so forth is also something we've seen more a rise in. And then, of course, technology and visibility is helping all of us make better decisions every day. And you can decrease quite a lot of cost and increase efficiency by looking at that. And then, we've kept it in there, but consider list and container load options. Sometimes if you split out cargo, and you can really diversify by taking, splitting up cargo if it's not all urgent. It's also about what type of product do you choose. So I think from our side, it's really talking about being agile. No matter what happens to which carrier and which alliance, make sure you have a plan to navigate and get your goods where they need to be on time. And now we have 1 minute left, so I think we're going to skip the Q&A, and I'm going to ask Lars and... Okay, Remke is saying no, we don't skip the Q&A. Okay, good. But then, Lars, Bjørn, anything critical we missed on this list?
No, I think all of it is there. The one thing I do want to bring up, we discussed it in the pre-call as well. For all the shippers that book on the variety of carriers that offer services through the risk area in the Red Sea, double check your insurance. Doesn't matter who you book with. If your cargo physically is on board a ship that gets attacked and that carrier decides to call general average, you want to make sure you're actually covered. With a standard normal insurance coverage, you might actually not be.
Yeah.
On that note, there is actually a question in the Q&A. Someone has heard a rumor that CMA is starting to go through the Suez. Anyone wants to confirm this or deny?
It's not a rumor. Not a rumor to
They
begin
are.
with.
It's public news, yes.
Yeah. So on that note, obviously the insurance part.
But
is
again,
really
I heard
important.
the underlying excitement in that question, and I would just refer back to Lars's comment right now. Make sure you have comprehensive general average insurance before you put your cargo on a ship that's going through that area. It can be very, very expensive if you don't. And there's no way out, by the way. You can't cut and run from a GA responsibility, but maybe that's the subject of a whole other webcast and many, many minutes.
Yeah, and maybe it becomes relevant. Right now we're seeing it slowly start. There's also a few niche carriers doing it.
Yeah.
But if this becomes a trend, it's obviously something to discuss. But we've seen some customers who ask not to go through Suez, especially for insurance purposes, and others who don't have the issue on the insurance. So it's an option for companies to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. There's someone, so this is a very specific question about Hamburg. Will Hapag-Lloyd no longer call Hamburg directly in 2025?
I don't know. I know they're skipping Antwerp in the Gemini Alliance, but I don't know about Hamburg.
I think they will call Hamburg, depends on the services. They will call Bremerhaven on some. I think AE1 and AE5 will call Hamburg. I think India as well. There was one service from India to Europe will also call Hamburg. But they are promoting that, forget the port's name,
Wilhelmshaven.
Yeah, Wilhelmshaven, yeah.
Which is actually a good alternative.
Lars, there's a question for you here. How much effective capacity is removed from the market due to the Suez diversions? And what are your thoughts on impact in 2024? It must be 2025. Should that situation be resolved? Will carriers see a bump in underutilization if schedules go back to normal, or is this in effect the new normal?
First of all, measuring the exact amount that goes around is a little bit elastic band by the meter because the vessels have changed speeds as well. But as a rough guideline, it has soaked up some 8 to 10% of the capacity to go around Africa. Now, if we look at 2025, if we still go around Africa, we will not see a peak season as strong as in 24 because we are still, as you showed, getting more vessels delivered. If the Suez routing gets opened, you're going to get the worst congestion we've ever seen in Europe. That's going to be for a temporary period. Once that is over, we're not going to get as crazy overcapacity as some think because the carriers, for starters, will likely continue to go around Africa on the backhaul.
Interesting. Okay. On that note, we're over time. And I just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and also to all of you celebrating Diwali or being out for Halloween today. Happy Diwali and happy Halloween. And then I need to see if I can find my notes here.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah,
thanks, everyone.
I have it here. I just want to call off. Okay, there is none. Good. So on that note, you know how to get the slides, and I hope you have responded to our survey. Thank you so much for attending, everyone, and appreciate all the questions.